out your Section 22 says that the money, whatever money you realize from there, you use to pay salaries and whatever. But government has taken over the responsibility of paying salaries. They pay you, they pay your overhead, they pay your capital. And so it is expected that the revenue you generate is remitted 100%. Do you have a legal department there? You have. So you have what you have done is willful. You decided on your own to disobey the law. You will be allowed to play with the revenue of the country. No agency, no matter how highly placed.
I hope members now have a copy on the MTEF, so the document is a copy like this. I hope members have copies. And I will be guided by the directive of the chairman to concentrate more on the revenue aspect. But I will also speak very broadly on the expenditure, because the size of the expenditure is also very critical for your review, Chairman and members. I will start my presentation from slide number 4, which is reading Introduction and Background. The draft MTEF for 2023 to 2025 has been prepared against the backdrop of continuing global and domestic challenges in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic. Factors that are impacting the medium-term fiscal outlook include the Russia and Ukraine war, the resurgence of COVID-19 in some major economies, which is resulting in slowdown on economic activities in those countries, including China, renewed and elevated inflation in most economies, prompting monetary tightening in these economics, with the inherent negative impact on capital inflow to emerging economies like Nigeria, challenging domestic macro and business environment, as well as the negative impact of insecurity on the domestic economy. At slide number 5, the Nigerian economy has, despite these challenges, sustained its recovery from recession for the 5th consecutive quarter, 6 quarters, if I may amend this, because last week we released our second quarter GDP report for Q2 2022. So while Q1 2022 was 3.11%, this has appreciated to 3.54% in the second quarter of 2022. Most sectors of the economy record positive growth. This broad-based growth reflects the effective implementation of the plans that we have been implementing with the support of the Parliament. At slide number 6, just to update the committee that the IMF projects global growth to slow down from an estimated 6.1% in 2021 to 3.6% in 2022 and the same rate in 2023. Nigeria continues to be exposed to risk aversion in the global capital markets, which will put further pressure on the foreign exchange market as foreign portfolio investors that have left our country are yet to return to the Nigerian market. The CBN expects the renewed pressure on the foreign exchange market and the accompanied Naira depreciation to begin to subside from the third quarter of 2023. I will now report briefly on an overview of the fiscal outcomes of current year 2022, as well as give an update on the 2022 Federation revenue performance. At slide number 8, is a report on the performance of the budget parameters, and this includes the oil production, which has been appropriated at 1.6 million barrels per day, but the actual outturns by July is an average of 1.32 million barrels per day. The crude oil price, which was appropriated at $73 per barrel for 2022, has improved significantly to $103.6 per barrel. Exchange rate, which was appropriated at 410 Naira 15 kobo to the US dollar, is now slightly up to 415.19 to the US dollar. Inflation, which we projected to be at an average of 13%, is now up to 17.71%. And this is as at July. It has, from all indications, it's still continuing to climb up. The GDP growth, which we had projected for 2022 to close at 4.2, we are moderating and adjusting it down to an actual of 3.11% as at the reporting period of July. Chairman and members, at slide 9, the average crude oil price, we all know, has been growing in the crude oil market, and this is supposed to have been an advantage to us, seeing as our budget was fixed at 73 and we have an average of 103. However, the higher oil price is offset by lower oil production output, which as at April stood at 1.32, and even up to July is still averaging the same. NNPC attributes this fall in production to the high incidence of crude oil theft and pipeline vandalization. Exchange rate, inflation, and GDP growth varied adversely from the targets that we have set. You can see from the report at slide 8. Growth is, however, expected to accelerate given efforts to contain structural issues impacting adversely on the cost of doing business in Nigeria. At slide number 10, is a report on the oil revenue performance. At slide number 10 is a report on the oil revenue performance. The gross oil and gas federation revenue for the full year 2022 was projected at 9.37 trillion. As at April, what was generated was 1.23 trillion. And this is as at April. And this is against what should have been generated at 3.12 trillion by April, representing a mere 39% oil and gas revenue performance. Despite higher oil prices, oil revenue has been underperforming due to the significant lower oil production shortfalls. And the main reasons, as I reported earlier on, had to do with pipeline vandalization and theft, and also which has resulted in oil production shut-ins by most of the major oil-producing entities. There's also higher petroleum subsidy cost, which is due to the higher landing cost of imported refined petroleum products into the country. As you know, honorable members, the higher the crude oil price in the international market, the higher the cost of PMS that is imported into the country. So non-oil taxes, on the other hand, have performed creditably well, averaging an average performance of 92.6% against the prorated target. Revenue performance is expected to improve in the second half of 2022 as a result of the concerted efforts to address the oil theft and pipeline vandalization. There is also seasonality in non-oil taxes, such as company income tax, which means that we expect to collect significantly more in non-oil revenues as well in the second half of 2022. The improved revenue collection should also moderate the debt service to revenue ratio, which is currently above our target level. At slide 11 is a tabulation of what I had presented as slide 10. So I'd like to move forward to slide 12. Again, this slide 12 is reporting on the Federation and VAT pool account distribution. The amount that was available for distribution from the main pool, the Federation account, again is 1.52 trillion. Of this amount, the federal government has received 802.5 billion, while the states and the local governments received 407.04 billion and 313.81 billion, respectively. The federal, state, and local governments received 107.67 billion, 358.90 billion and 251.23 billion, respectively, from the VAT pool. At slide 13 is a tabulation of the distribution as presented in slide 12. I want to now move up to an update on the 2022 budget expenditure performance, and this will be very high level, Honorable Chairman and members. As at April, federal government's retained revenue was only 1.6 trillion, which represents 49% of the prorated target of 3.32 trillion. The federal share of oil revenue was 39%, while non-oil revenue was an aggregate of 92%. But you can see that company income tax was 99%, while VAT was 98% performance. And we expect even higher performance in the second half of the year. Customs collections, on the other hand, is 76.77%, representing 25.42%, much lower than what was projected in the appropriation. Other revenues amounted to actual collection as at April, 664.64 billion, of which independent revenue is 394.09 billion. I'd like to state here, honorable members, that we are seeing increasing performance of independent revenues because of the finance acts that you passed, which has pegged the revenue to expenditure ratio of government-owned enterprises to 50-50. At slide 16, the aggregate expenditure for 2022 is 17.32 trillion. That is the budget size that was passed by the Parliament. With a prorated spending of 5.77 trillion as at the end of April, the actual spending as at 31st of April was 4.72 trillion. Of this amount, 1.94 trillion was for debt service, 1.26 trillion was for personnel costs, and as at the end of April, 773.63 billion has been spent on capital expenditure. At slide 17, reporting on the deficit performance. The fiscal deficit for 2022 is estimated to be 7.32 trillion, and that is 3.09 trillion deficit as at April, that is prorated. And this, 3.09 trillion is the actual deficit as at April, and this reflects 636.97 billion above the prorated target. So deficit has been running at a rate higher than expected when you consider it to the actual revenue performance. The level of borrowing is 1.05 trillion, and this is ahead of the prorated target as at April. And this is so because we decided to front-load the borrowing so that we have more resources to release earlier in the year to avoid a situation where during the last quarter of the year we're releasing capital funds and agencies are not able to use it. So this was by design that we front-loaded the borrowing, especially the domestic borrowing. I'm moving on now to the 2023 to 2025 medium-term expenditure framework and to speak to the assumptions and the macroeconomic framework. This MTEF is prepared following a number of key parameters, as well as a consideration of the macroeconomic projections that are driving medium-term revenue and expenditure, and the revision that we have had to make to bring the projections in line with emergent realities. The new figures are presented in this table below. We had made amendments to what was projected in our medium-term development plan, the 2021 to 2025, but we had to adjust for things like growth and inflation to bring this to current realities. So the oil price is, if I may just move to slide 20, the medium-term projections deviate from the National Development Plan, and this have been done based on a combination of the current realities and a modified medium-term outlook. In the MTEF, the real GDP growth is 3.75% in 2023, from a revised projection of 3.55% for 2022. Growth is expected to moderate to 3.3% in 2024 before picking up to 3.46% in 2025. Inflation is projected to grow to an average of 17.16% in 2023, up from the revised average of 16.11% in 2022. There will be upward pressure on prices, which is expected to be driven by the current lag effect of the global price surge due to the Russia-Ukraine war. There's also the pressures from domestic insecurity, the rising cost of imports, as well as the exchange rate depreciation, as well as the other supply side constraints. Growth at slide 21, growth in nominal consumption has been adjusted also in line with the revised estimate based on changes in the components of the GDP and the historical performance. The medium-term nominal consumption, is projected to be 121.93 trillion and 123.69 trillion and 125.45 trillion for 2023, 2024, and 2025, respectively. Investment, especially from foreign sources, is expected to be dragged down by interest rate hikes in advanced economies, foreign exchange management concerns, as well as other domestic challenges, including insecurity. At slide 23, is an overview of the 2023 to 2025 medium-term revenue framework. The projected fiscal outcomes in the medium term are presented we presented them to the leadership of the National Assembly and to the Federal Executive Council. We presented two scenarios. Scenario one was a business as usual scenario. This assumed that the subsidy on PMS is estimated to have been 6.72 trillion for the full year. That is, if we decide to keep subsidy from January to December. Scenario two is what we call the reform scenario. This assumes that PMS subsidy will remain only up to June, that is mid-year 2023, based on the 18-month extension that was announced earlier in 2021, based on which the 2022 budget was amended, in which case only 3.36 trillion will be provided for in the 2023 appropriation. Additionally, there will also be tighter enforcement of performance management framework for government-owned enterprises that will significantly increase operating surplus as well as dividend remittances in 2023. Both scenarios, of course, have implications for net accretion to the Federation account and the projected revenue deficit. I must report here that the Federal Executive Council chose to approve scenario two, which is to say that the PMS subsidy will be provided only for January to June. And that is what is conveyed to the Parliament for consideration. At slide 24 is a table that shows the oil and gas revenues. And you will see that the oil production has been projected to be at 1.69 million barrels per day, with a projected crude oil price per barrel of $70 and an average exchange rate of 435 Naira 57 kobo to the US dollar. So I'll be going through scenario two because that is what was formally presented to the Parliament. And I apologize because we didn't have time to adjust this. We just printed and came. It will mean that the total oil and gas revenue with these parameters will be 8.5 trillion, out of which 13% derivation will be 1.105 trillion, with a net oil and gas revenue after 13% derivation of 7.396 trillion. There will be also other deductions of other statutory deductions of 3.537 trillion. So federally funded oil and gas revenues we have projected to have stopped in 2022 because of the transiting of NNPC to NNPC Limited. The only assumption we are keeping is that the Federation will be bearing the cost of subsidy as opposed to the NNPC. And also there's one line item which is titled PMS under recovery, which is a historical item that has been amortized over a couple of years that is still being repaid back. So only these two items. So other upstream projects such as National Gas Development, Gas Infrastructure Project, Crude Oil Export Inspection Expenses, Frontier Exploration, Renewable Energy Development, Pipeline Security Costs, Pre-Export Financing, all of these are projected to be carried by the NNPC, new NNPC Limited. With this scenario too, it will mean that the net oil and gas revenue after costs and deductions will be 3.858 trillion naira. If you just look at scenario 1, if we hold on to 12 months for subsidy, this net oil and gas revenue will have been 500 billion naira. The 2014, we're assuming, and 2015 that there will be no 2024 and 2025, we're assuming that there will be no PMS subsidy in those outer years. And you will see how the revenue, the net oil and gas revenue, has moved up to 7.6 trillion and 7.5 trillion respectively. As slide 26 is a tabulation at 26. Oh, 25. Where's 25? You have, okay. Okay, I think maybe it's the numbering, but, okay. So at the next slide is still further details of the revenue broken down into the share of oil revenue, showing the dividends from NLNG and dividends from other sources like Bank of Industry. We also show the mineral share of revenue, and also non-oil revenue taxes such as company income tax, VAT, customs, and share of the Federation account. There's also indicated in that page the share of electronic money transfer, which was formerly called stamp duty, the share of oil price royalties, the share of revenues from government-owned enterprises, and the government-owned enterprises operating surpluses, that is the 80% which is captured as independent revenue. There's also the independent revenues from the non-GOEs. Then there's a drawdown from special accounts which we are projecting will also be appropriated. There's signature bonuses. This is input from the Upstream Regulatory Authority. There's domestic recoveries, as well as grant and donor funding. So these are loans that we are projecting will be drawn down during these periods. There's also the Education Tax Fund. So with all of this at scenario 2, you will see that from the amount available for FGN budget, including government-owned enterprises retained revenue, the total amount will be 7.2 trillion. And the total amount that will be available for FGM budget will be 8.46 trillion when you add all of the non-oil revenues plus the oil revenues. So in addition to subsidy reform, scenario 2 assumes an aggressive implementation of the cost-to-income limits of the government-owned enterprises. And with this, in 2023, the federal government revenue is projected to be 8.4 trillion. This is 15% higher than the 1.51 trillion, or 1.51 trillion less than the 2022 budget. But it is 2.12 trillion more than what will have been in scenario 1. Of this 8.48 trillion, 1.99 trillion, or 23%, is projected to come from oil-related sources, while the whole of the balance is from non-oil sources. A In the next slide, which is a continuation reporting the federal government expenditure, as scenario 2, which is the scenario that is presented to Parliament, the federal government 2023 aggregate expenditure is projected to be 19.76 trillion. This is inclusive of government-owned enterprises. In this scenario, the budget deficit is projected to be 11.30 trillion in 2023. This is up from 7.35 trillion in 2022. This represents 5.01% of the estimated GDP, above the 3% threshold as stipulated in the Fiscal Responsibility Act. Again, at the next slide, again on scenario 2, the budget deficit is projected to be 11.30%. If we are trillion, if we are to assume that there will be no subsidy in 2023, we have a chance to bring this down to the threshold that is allowed by the Fiscal Responsibility Act, because that will be 3.35 trillion less in terms of deficit. Honorable members, Chairman, honorable members, this draft MTEF has been prepared again against the backdrop of very significant continuing global challenges, and there's an overall fiscal risk which are quite elevated following weaker than expected domestic economic performance and structural issues in the domestic economy. Revenue generation remains the major fiscal constraint of the federal government. The systemic resource mobilization problem has been compounded by recent global recessions. We do hope that the work of this